The workshop smelled like oil, sawdust, and old silence. It had been that way for as long as he could remember. A tomb of half-finished projects, rusted coffee cans full of screws, and that damn wall clock that never kept the right time. After the funeral, he hadn't planned to step in here. But something, maybe habit, maybe gravity, pulled him toward the back of the garage, past the workbench where his father used to mutter at machines, past the shelves that hadn't been dusted in years. That clock still ticked, slow and offbeat, like it was stalling on purpose. When he reached for it, he wasn't even sure why. Maybe he wanted to stop it once and for all. Maybe he wanted a souvenir. But when he lifted it off the wall, something dropped out behind it, something thin, flat, and yellowed with time. It was a photograph. 5 men stood in a row, dusty and grinning, in front of what looked like an M113 armored personnel carrier. Jungle vines crept behind them, and the sun was brutal, bleaching the edges of the photo. And there, second from the left, a young man who looked exactly like his father. Only, it couldn't be. The date written on the back was August 1971. But his father, according to every official record and every family story ever told, had never served in Vietnam. He'd worked at a hardware store. He fixed lawnmowers. He raised one son. That was it. He stared at the photo again. The resemblance was undeniable. Same jawline. Same look in the eyes. That weary defiance his father had worn even while flipping pancakes on Sunday morning. But this man was in uniform. Military. Jungle boots. And on his shoulder, an insignia that didn't quite match anything he'd seen before. Like it belonged to a unit that didn't want to be remembered. He flipped the photo back over. A single name was written in faded blue ink. Keller. No first name. Just that. But his father's name was James Keller, not Michael, not Jack. James. And yet, that night, he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the photo like it might blink. The clock from the garage now sat on the counter, ticking faintly. Somewhere between the hiss of the kettle and the glow of the fridge light, the question formed. Who was the man in that photo? And more terrifying, why had it been hidden? He tried a reverse image search. Nothing. The jungle backdrop was generic. The APC could have been anywhere. And none of the other faces matched any names he could find in military records. It was like the picture had never existed, like someone had gone out of their way to erase it from history. He went to the box of papers his father kept under the bed, utility bills, tax returns, warranty cards for machines that hadn't worked since the 80s. But near the bottom, folded between 2 pages of a Sears catalog, he found a receipt. Army surplus. April 1993. 1 dog tag chain replacement, custom nameplate, M. Keller. That name again. Not James. M. Keller. So either his father had a brother no one talked about, or his name, the name he had worn his whole life, wasn't the one he'd been born with. He called his aunt. The phone rang 5 times. Hey, it's me. Do you remember if Dad ever went by a different name? A pause. Where's this coming from? No reason. He lied. Just cleaning the garage. Found some weird stuff. Another pause. Then, he had a friend. Used to come around when we were kids. Mike Keller. They looked alike. Creepy alike. And? He left one day. Never came back. Your dad changed after that. That was it. No further details. No encouragement. She changed the subject to the weather and hung up a few minutes later, leaving the silence ringing louder than the dial tone. He didn't sleep that night. He laid awake with the photo beside him like it might whisper something if he stared long enough. And somewhere around 3 a.m., a sentence lodged itself in his brain like a splinter. Maybe he wasn't your father. Not really. Not fully. But then who was he? At dawn, he opened the drawer beside the kitchen sink. Inside, buried under receipts and bent keys, was an old dog tag, the kind he'd seen worn in war movies. The text was worn but still readable. M. Keller. OPOS. USMC. hashtag 672-11-0924. The same number etched onto the back of the photograph, so faint he hadn't noticed it until now. It wasn't a mystery anymore. It was a map. And it led not to his father's life, but to the man his father used to be. Outside, the sky was that strange blue-gray color of early morning, the kind that feels like anything might happen. He stepped out of the garage, photo in his pocket, dog tag in hand, and made his way toward the old truck his father had refused to sell. It still smelled like pine air freshener and motor oil. But now it smelled like questions. As he turned the key, a thought struck him. Maybe some people don't change their names to hide from the law. Maybe they do it to bury a war. And maybe, just maybe, the man who raised him had been living two lives the whole time. One as the father he thought he knew, and the other as someone the world had deliberately forgotten. The drive out of town felt longer than it should have. Each mile marker flicked by like a countdown, each highway sign a quiet dare to turn around. The dog tag rested in his palm as he drove, warm from his grip, the edges cutting faint crescents into his skin. The numbers on it, hashtag 672-11-0924, weren't just an identification. They were coordinates. Or at least, that's what he hoped. Because he needed them to be more than just proof his father had lied. He needed them to mean something. He stopped at a roadside diner with cracked red vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like scorched regret. He opened his phone, entered the string of numbers into a GPS converter. They pointed to a stretch of land outside Khe Sanh, Vietnam. A place that hadn't been on any family vacation map. A place his father had never mentioned. The photograph was propped against the sugar dispenser. 5 men. Jungle. A face scratched out so violently it had torn the paper fibers. Who had tried to erase that face? And why? A few hours later, he sat parked outside the county records office. The building looked tired, stucco walls stained by decades of rain, a sign out front tilting slightly as if embarrassed to stand straight. He carried the dog tag and photo inside like talismans, stepping carefully across the linoleum that squeaked with every footfall. The clerk, a man with reading glasses too large for his nose, squinted at the dog tag. "You want military service records?" "Yes." "For a Michael Keller." The clerk's fingers clacked across the keyboard. Then he frowned. "Nothing comes up." "You sure about the name?" He pushed the dog tag across the counter, voice tightening. "This says otherwise." The clerk studied it, sighed, and walked into the back room. When he returned, he carried a dusty binder with a cracked spine. He laid it down with the caution of someone opening a casket. Inside, between pages yellowed and brittle, were lists of men, names, dates, units. On one page, almost lost in the margin, it was there. Michael Keller. USMC. Assigned, MACVSOG. Status, disposition undocumented. MACVSOG. Historians still debate whether that unit's actions were courageous or criminal. Officially called the Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, it specialized in cross-border operations that technically weren't supposed to exist. They infiltrated Laos and Cambodia, ran black ops, and left few records behind. Thomas's breath caught. If his father had served with SOG, he hadn't just been a soldier. He'd been a ghost. An unrecorded blade in America's silent wars. He flipped the binder's next page. Red ink covered half of it, heavy lines blacking out details. But 3 words remained untouched at the bottom, stamped in an uneven typeface. Extracted Khe Sanh. The coordinates made sense now. They weren't random. They marked the location of his father's last known operation. Or maybe Michael Keller's last mission. He thanked the clerk, though his voice barely worked, and stumbled outside into the noon light that felt too bright, too clean, too normal for what he'd just learned. Back home, he laid the photo on his kitchen table again, aligning it carefully like a relic. He pulled out the map his father had kept folded under the truck's seat, edges soft from decades of handling. He traced the line from Khe Sanh to the border, seeing paths only men like Michael Keller had walked. That night, he called his aunt again. This time he didn't ask about names. Do you remember Dad going away for long stretches? Maybe when you were kids? She hesitated. He'd be gone for weeks sometimes. Mom said he was working overtime at the plant. But he always came back different. Quieter. And did he ever talk about Vietnam? A longer pause. Then softly, no. But he woke up screaming. A lot. He barely slept. He could almost hear the humid air of Khe Sanh, smell the jungle rot and cordite. He pictured his father, or Michael, moving through the trees, eyes alert, heart pounding, rifle at the ready. He imagined what it felt like to cross lines no map acknowledged. Morning came like a thief, prying open his eyes. He packed a small bag, folding the photo and dog tag inside. He booked a flight. He wasn't sure what he'd find in Vietnam, but he knew the only answers waited there. At the airport, he handed his ticket to a woman who smiled without seeing him. As he boarded, he looked out across the tarmac. The jet engines whined like distant mortar fire. He gripped the dog tag tight. The flight was long, uncomfortable. His mind replayed every conversation he'd ever had with his father, every joke, every lesson, every moment he'd felt proud of the man who taught him how to swing a bat or fix a carburetor. And now, every memory shimmered with doubt. Had it been a mask? Or had his father truly tried to leave Michael Keller behind? He landed in Hanoi, sweat already beading on his forehead before he even left the plane. The air was thicker here, pressing against his skin. He rented a car that smelled of old cigarettes and moldy upholstery. He drove south, heart hammering in sync with the kilometer markers ticking by. At a small village market, he stopped to buy water. An elderly man eyed him from a stall, gaze drifting to the dog tag hanging from his neck. American? The man asked. He hesitated. My father was. The old man nodded slowly, eyes clouded with a mix of understanding and something close to pity. Many Americans came here. Few returned whole. He thanked him and kept driving. Hours later, the GPS guided him off paved roads onto dirt paths framed by jungle reclaiming its own. Leaves slapped the windshield. Branches clawed at the sides. Finally, the trail ended at an overgrown clearing, the coordinates dead center in the open space. He stepped out. The ground beneath his boots felt spongy, alive. Insects droned like a distant, angry chorus. He pulled out the photo and held it up. The trees had changed, but the land remembered. He knelt and pressed the dog tag into the soil. For the first time, he spoke aloud to the ghosts. I'm here. I know. The words fell flat in the heavy air, but they were enough. For now. The jungle quiet wasn't silence. It had its own hum, the low whir of insects, distant bird calls sharp as warnings, and the occasional rustle of leaves that made your spine stiffen. He stood in the overgrown clearing, still gripping the photo, the damp edges curled now from sweat and humidity. The same clearing from the picture. The same stretch of green swallowing what remained of a war his father never spoke about. He walked the field, boots crunching on soft earth. And then, just past a cluster of bamboo, he saw it, half buried, rusted through, and overtaken by vines, the outline of a jeep. Or what was left of one. No markings. No license plate. But unmistakably military. The frame sagged under decades of decay, the windshield collapsed in on itself. He dropped to his knees beside it, and started digging with his hands, unsure what he hoped to find. Maybe nothing. Maybe something impossible. After 15 minutes, his fingers struck metal. A rusted lid. A tin container, maybe 10 inches long. He pulled it free from the earth like unearthing a time capsule. Which, in a way, it was. He pried it open. Inside were 3 things. A folded letter sealed in plastic. A Polaroid photo, faded almost to white. And a second dog tag. This one read, Nguyen Thi Lan. OPOS. Civilian. Hashtag 245, Vien. He stared at the photo. It took a second for his brain to catch up with his eyes. It was him, as a baby. Being held by a woman he didn't recognize. Her eyes, though, they carried the same quiet strength he saw in his father's on bad days. The same haunted weight. The photo was taken outside a small house, cement walls, a bicycle leaning against the frame. He unfolded the letter last. The handwriting was smooth but rushed, in Vietnamese. He couldn't read it, but even the lines on the paper felt like they were grieving. He returned to the village from the day before and found the old man again. "Can you read this?" he asked, holding out the letter. The old man took it gently, studied it under the flickering light of a hanging bulb, and read in a soft, uneven voice. To the one he called his son. "If you are reading this, he is gone. He said you would never know. That was his burden to carry. But I asked him to leave something, so the silence would not be the only thing left between us. He came here to save lives. Mine. Yours. He loved, even when he was told not to. He stayed, even when he was told to leave. He was not only your father. He was a man who lived many lives, under many names. But the one thing he never changed was his heart. Lon." The man finished reading and looked up. "You are her son?" "I think so." He smiled faintly, then nodded. "Then you carry the silence now." He stood alone outside the market that night, letter folded in his hand, the jungle behind him like a closed mouth. His father, Michael or James or whatever his true name had been, hadn't lied out of shame. He had hidden a second life out of protection. The war didn't just take lives. It fractured them, split them into versions that couldn't coexist in daylight. He had another family once. Maybe even another son. Maybe he had tried to stay in Vietnam and failed. Or been ordered to disappear. The possibilities churned like rain clouds. And yet, despite everything, the thing that struck him most wasn't betrayal. It was the photo. The way the woman looked at him, not as a secret, not as a regret, but as something precious. And his father had kept that picture. Buried. But kept. When he returned home weeks later, everything felt smaller. The workshop. The tools. The life his father had built. But now, he understood the tightness in the man's shoulders. The way he never talked about the past. The missing years. He didn't throw the letter away. He framed it, along with the photo of Lon holding him, and placed it on the same workbench where the clock used to hang crooked. He didn't know if he'd ever go back to Vietnam. But he didn't need to. Some stories aren't meant to be finished. They're meant to be passed on. And some names, though never written in books, are carried forward in silence. There are truths we learn too late, sometimes on foreign soil, sometimes in forgotten drawers. And sometimes, not even spoken, only hinted at, left behind in quiet objects, in dog tags and faded photos no one was ever meant to find. Tonight, as the air cools and the noise of the day dies down, maybe you're thinking of your own version of this story. A person you never really understood. A box you never opened. A silence you mistook for distance, when it was really protection. Let that be okay. We don't always need full explanations to feel full love. Some men show it with silence. With actions stitched between time and trauma. With the way they stood in the kitchen before dawn. With the way they looked at you when they thought you weren't watching. So wherever you are right now, in your room, in your car, on a bus headed somewhere unfamiliar, take a breath. Close your eyes. And know this. The people who loved you the most may have never known how to say it. But they showed you, with what they carried. And more importantly, with what they chose not to carry onto you.